4. Kismel offered to teleport us with her elven charm, to a location near the main town, but Asuna and I gratefully declined. We headed through the narrow canyon, still choked with the mist after the sunshine, and into the deep forest that made up the third floor. I turned back to look at the camp we'd spent the last 15 hours around, glance at the rippling flags. A few more yards into the forest, and they would already be invisible. Asuna had the same concerns on her mind. We'll be able to get back here, won't we? We can make it back, I think. It should be marked on our maps. You think? It should? She looked even more skeptical now. I opened my menu and flipped to the map. Most of the floor of the Wandering Mist that made up the southern half of the map was grayed out, with only the routes we'd travel visible. But the locations we'd visited, the exit of the staircase from below the Queen Spider Cave and the Dark Elf base, were all marked by dots, so we'd be able to reach them again without getting lost. I hoped. First, we set off for the staircase pavilion through which we'd come to this floor that required trudging through the forest without a path, of course, but it wasn't the main reason for the feeling of concern in our hearts. We were without our talented NPC guide, the elite mob, Dark Elven Royal Guard Kismel, and that left us feeling alone and vulnerable. Perhaps we should have waited a few days to return to the town and stayed here doing quests with Kismel instead, I wondered. Asuna spoke up, her voice as weak as my own thoughts. Hey, about Kismel. But her words faded out before she could form them into a clear question. I glanced over at the fencer, whose hood was pulled back. The fleeting smile on her lips seemed to contain a number of different emotions. We can't keep relying on her the way we have. We're going to have to say goodbye to her someday. Good point, I agreed. Then spread my hands. Besides, my beater knowledge doesn't help us regarding Kismel. Ever since you beat that forest elf guy in the original battle, we've been on a quest path that I've never been a part of. Don't try to act like you did all of that on your own. Look, I'm just saying. Like 80% of the damage was from an irregular sound came from the forest ahead. And I stopped in place, holding out my arm. Asuna took a fighting stance and focused. Little rustling sounds grew louder and louder. A few seconds later, a silhouette appeared in the drifting mist, low and long. It was not human, but insectoid. No, a mammal. There were 5 types of animal-based creatures in this forest, but one of them looked like this. I reached back for my Neelblade +8 and gave a brief explanation. That's a wolf. It doesn't have any annoying special attacks, but it'll howl to draw more of its kind when it loses half of its HP. Once the gauge goes yellow, use the sword skill to finish it off quick. Got it, she responded. I drew my blade. The shape beyond the mist suddenly charged, as though drawn by my metal grasp. The bright yellow mane from the head back and long, slender snout marked it as a foe as I remember struggling against in the beta, the roaring wolf. I was the wolf's target, so Asuna backed out of range. The beast tensed up, pouncing in mid-charge. This leap attack came down nearly vertical, but if the player tried to simply guard against the wolf's 6-foot-long body, they'd almost certainly get knocked back, if not into a tumble status, followed by the beast's fangs closing in. The better choice were to dodge out of the way or fight back with a sword skill, but an anti-air skill that moved from low to high were an acute weakness of one-handed sword category. The best angle I had currently was the second blow of the vertical arc, but this was extremely hard to place accurately, given that the first swing would miss. I lowered my blade and crouched slightly, watching the wolf's descent closely. I waited to the right moment, and then leapt with all my strength. My right leg took on a glowing effect, and my body rocketed off with an unseen force. The vertical kick, as part of a backflip, the martial arts skill Crescent Moon, caught the roaring wolf right in the throat and threw it back upward with a yelp. The martial arts skill I'd learned with great pain, in more ways than one, from the bearded master on the second floor was an incredibly useful tool to have. Unfortunately, it did not add its own power to the player's limbs, so its damage couldn't match that of my sword. Despite the well-placed blow being classified as a counter, the wolf still had 80% of its health left. I wasn't sure if I had time to follow up with a sword strike before the wolf regained its balance, but I wanted to get more damage before I handed the fight over. But before either the wolf or I had landed, I heard the voice shout, "Switch!" The fencer flew into the fray from the right, cape streaming behind her. She held her chivalric rapier to her right side as she ran, starting the motion for a 2-hit combo, parallel sting. I was a bit worried that she might not be used to the different weight of the new weapon, but as soon as I saw that silver shooting star again, and a thrust faster than my eye could follow caught the falling wolf. With a heavy, satisfying slam, the roaring wolf shot away, spinning helplessly in midair, and smashed into a distant tree. The wolf's HP bar dropped precisely from 70 to 60, and down into the yellow zone. "Oops," I muttered. The rapier still held out in front of her. Asuna said, "Uh-oh." We immediately raced forward, but the wolf had already getting to its feet, so to let out a long howl from its lengthy throat. Soon, more howls responded from elsewhere in the forest. Asuna stopped and glanced at me, then shrugged and pleaded. "Well, I didn't know 2 hits were going to do so much damage." It took nearly 10 minutes to take care of the pack of wolves that gathered. It was always dangerous to get in a drawn-out battle with monsters who could summon allies, but we were close enough to the camp that we could retreat if necessary. At least then, the worst we'd suffer was Kismil's disappointment. We sighed with relief and returned our swords to the sheaths once the 5th and final wolf was dead, before it could call yet more allies. The Anneal Blade +8 performed even better than I expected, but the true stunner was the Chivalric Rapier +5. The fencer lived and died by the numbers of strikes they could inflict, and each of Asuna's thrusts was heavy as 2-handed spear, and there were still 10 potential upgrades left. I shuddered to think at what it could do if it was fully upgraded. The fencer herself strode through the dapple shade of the trees, oblivious to my astonishment. She was probably more concerned with her rapier's feel and balance than its numerical stats. She wanted that feeling of trust, the reassurance that she could keep fighting to her heart's content with that sword. No doubt, feeling was crucial. In the days of the game's monitor before the nerve gear came along, the way of the gamer's mouse and keyboard felt and responded was of the utmost importance. I once knew more than a few players who stockpiled multiple units of their favorite devices just in case the manufacturer stopped selling them. But I couldn't help but feeling prioritizing gut feeling over numerical logic in this VR MMO was living dangerously. Ironically, the only proof I had to back my suspicion was another gut feeling, but it was undeniable. "Wait," Asuna said, suddenly muttered, and I nearly walked directly into her. I paused in my awkward, unnatural pose, scanning the surroundings. I'd been deep in thought, but not carelessly so. I didn't sense any monsters around, either visually or audibly. No, wait. There was a high-pitched metal clang somewhere far off. It happened again, then again. The sound was not in rhythm, but it kept happening. Sword combat? Asuna wondered, turning to me. I nodded. This was sword art online. The sound of battle were not uncommon. The problem was that the Forest of Wandering Mist did not feature weapon-swinging enemies, like the kobold or the Tauruses of the floors below.
The only possibilities were dark and forest elves fighting elves against players, or worst of all, PvP. Players versus players. I wanted to believe it was not the last option. It was hard to imagine people setting up a proper duel out in the dangerous area, and if it wasn't a duel, it had to be. I forced myself not to think about that. Let's go check it out, just in case. Asuna looked unsure for a moment, then said, "All right." The audible range of the battle depended on the terrain, weather, and status of those listening. But in any case, it was not particularly wide. We stayed low, following the source of the sound for several minutes. Then noticed flashes of light amid the grove of trees ahead. The sign of a sword skill in action. A few yards ahead, we put our backs against the trunk of a particularly old and large tree, then peered around to either side. The first thing I noticed was a semicircle of 5 players with their backs toward us. They wore matching blue doublets with silver highlights, the unmistakable sign of Lin's Dragon Knights. The blue-haired man in the center, with his long hair pulled into a ponytail, had to be Lin himself. He raised his curved pale edge high, timing his orders, but the sound of battle were coming from beyond the waiting group of 5. I leaned out farther, curious as who was fighting, so I could see beyond the group. The first thing I noticed was a whirling green cape, platinum blonde hair, and long ears. That was not a player, but a forest elf knight, exactly identical to the forest elven hollowed knight that Asa and I fought the night before. The snow white elf had his back to Lind group as he struggled in violent battle with someone else. His back was completely exposed, but none of the 5 made any move to strike, which meant, are they in the middle of the Jade Key quest? Asuna wondered, her back to mine. I think so, and they probably took the forest elf side, which would mean the elf is fighting. I suddenly felt a trembled jolt through my back from Asuna. She must have come to my conclusion. On the other side of the Dragon Knights and the elite forest elf would be another dark-skinned, purple-haired, dark elven royal guard. In other words, a second Kismel. It was possible. In fact, it was inevitable. Anyone who could take on the dark elf had to be occurring at every moment somewhere. And it was extremely strange to think that many Kismels existing at once, but we had no right to demand that every player in the game would avoid the quest. All we could watch was the 2 elves fought to their mutual deaths. But it wasn't true. I knew from experience it was possible to avoid double KO to ensure the champion selected would survive. I learned that fact because I was working with Asuna yesterday. If I had been just me alone, I would have been trapped by my beta knowledge, focused solely on defending myself rather than defeating on the forest elf. But Asuna took everything the dead seriously, using all of her power to challenge an elite foe far stronger than herself, and won. Of course, Kismel did most of the damage, and I fought very hard myself, but that outcome would not have transpired without Asuna's presence. With that in mind, it was clear that Lin's blue team knew what they were doing with this quest. Either Argo had already released the first volume of her 3rd floor strategy guide just a day in, and they learned about the quest through other means. At any rate, the fact that they were sitting back rather than taking part in the fight meant they knew what would happen, and were waiting for an enemy elf to unleash the major attack, prompting the friendly elf to perform a self-sacrifice to win the fight. What should we do? I bit my lip in frustration. Should I leap into the fray, advising Lind that if they tried their best to defeat the enemy, the survivor would be a powerful companion in the campaign? But Lind was nearly suspicious of me and Kambao. Would he really listen? The other factor was that if we did that, Asa and I would be assisting the murder of a second Kismel. It would be shameless, sentimentally, of course. We sided with Kismel on nothing more than a whim, and callously slaughtered the forest elf. There was no right or wrong between the elven races. If we'd chosen, for whatever reason, to help the forest elf, we'd have killed Kismel. spent the night at the Forest Elf base, and forged a pact of friendship with him instead. And just moments before, I'd been scolding myself about the dangers of prioritizing sentiment over logic. But I bit my lip even harder. A hoarse voice sounded in my ear. "Sorry, this is your call, Kirito." Deep internal conflict was evident in Asuna's words. As few as they were, she was grappling with the contradiction, just as I was. Damn these quests, I muttered to myself. I'd just discussed the inherent contradiction and dilemmas of MMORPG quests with Asuna last night. There could never be just one hero in the world, with thousands of players logged in at once. Everyone had the right to experience the story as the protagonist, even now with the stakes turned deadly. Especially now. But sometimes different players following different stories would intersect. We could not come to so close to contact with Cabal in the cave this morning, or Lind in the forest right now. If that happened, the story lost its consistency. It was no longer unique. The ideal way to handle this was to spirit away every player or party in our own instance the moment this quest began, isolated from contact with anyone else. But it was also impossible to generate dozens, if not hundreds of maps and dungeons at the same time. It was surprising enough to me that the elf base was an instance. Plus, too many instances remove the entire point of an MMO. How could you share a world where no one was connected? As I gritted my teeth, the battle between elves and knights rose in intensity. Based on the state of their HP gauges, if I wanted to convince Lind, there was no time left to make up my mind. But in fact, this was not the time for hesitation. In the first place, preserving the integrity of the story was not what mattered here. It was escaping SAO. I ought to do everything I could to increase that possibility. "Let's go," I murmured, and I felt Asuna agree. Suddenly, the positions fiercely clashing elf and knight switched 90 degrees, and I saw the dark elf who had been blocked by a green cape until this moment. The black and purple armor, long saber, and small kite shield of the dark-skinned, pale purple hair were exactly the same as Kismel's. But that was all. "Huh?" Asuna exclaimed. My eyes were wide with shock. The dark elf knight, hair slicked back, was just as tall as the opposing forest elf. The arms were bulging and muscular, and the face was beautiful and proud and masculine. As I watched in astonishment, the dark elf knight that leaping forward with powerfully evading the forest elf's longsword and swiping upward to catch him with a solid blow, the blonde knight was knocked back several feet, grunted, and collapsed. Rather than chase down his opponent, the dark elf glared menacingly at Lind's group. His saber took on a purple glow. Lind lowered his scimitar and raised his shield. "All members, defend!" His 4 companions raised their shields or large weapons in defense stances. We'd lost our chance to intercept the encounter. If we darted out of the trees, Lind's group would panic and possibly lose their defensive positions. The dark elf let off a sword skill directly at the tight cluster of defenders. He slid forward to close the gap and slashed faster than the eye could follow with his saber, left to right. With each collision of purple light and shield, a roar of sparks and bursts forth. But none of them fell. I thought they'd successfully held strong, but the elf wasn't done. Spinning like a top, he unleashed another side swipe. Then again, there were 3 attacks together, were high saber sword skills called treble scythe. The second blow knocked down the team's defenses wall, and the third sent them all sprawling. They landed in an enormous clatter about 6 or 7 yards away from where Asuna and I were watched behind the grove. All 5 of their HP bars plunged into the yellow. I knew what would happen next. Presumably, so did the team, but my pulse raced out of control, virtually sweating from my palms. I could feel a tension just short of outright panic from the 5 players looking up at the approaching dark elf. Asuna took a step forward, but I hastily reached out to grab her hood. The dark elf spoke in a voice as sharp as steel.
"If you'd followed my warning and left, this would not have happened. Foolish humans, accept the punishment for your actions." It was the exact same line I'd heard in the Jade Key quest during the beta.
The dark elf held his saber with both hands overhead, pointing straight for Lind. Lind raised his shield out of impulse, but would not stop the coming blow. The elf's weapon began to glow, accompanied by a keening vibration.
I am your foe, Knight of Lasulia, bellowed the forest elf, who was back on his feet and charging. He struck with astonishing speed, long sword growing green. The dark elf was unable to evade in time. He caught the strike with his saber, and the resulting shockwave sent Lind's group sprawling to the ground again. Even the tree trunk we hid behind trembled with the force of the collision. The two elves were locked in a stalemate, their blades grinding. But the forest elf, whose HP bar was in the red, slowly began to give. When the saber was pushed right in front of his eyes, the forest elf cried out, "Holy Tree of Kael'za, grant me this final sacrament!" A brilliant yellow-green shine erupted from the forest elf's chest. When it had spread to cover his entire body, it shot out rapidly to engulf the surrounding area. It did not look like an attack, but the dark elf's HP bar quickly drained to nothing. The forest elves emptied with it. Still locked in combat, their swords joined in a standstill. The two fighters slowly collapsed. Every detail was as I remembered it. I had witnessed this scene 3 times in the beta, once for my own quest, twice while helping a party member. Whether it was on the dark or forest elf side, the event dialogue were all the same. At the time, I hadn't given it much thought, other than it was common development, but this time it felt as though I'd been stabbed to the chest. I could only take a short, grasping breath, and I clutched at the ends of Asana's cape. Before he perished into motes of light with Dark Elf, the Forest Elf imparted his final message to the Dragon Knight. Only a small leather pouch was left behind on the grass, which Lind reached out and picked up. A greatsword-wielding man named Hafner, who was something like a second command of the group, plopped down into the grass and explained, "Whoa, man, that was scary." I could vividly recall him swearing at Naza for using the money from his sword to buy himself a feast when the blacksmith had admitted his crimes after the second floor boss battle. It seemed like he'd been repaid with a weapon of similar level. Shavita, another one of the scam victims, was present in the group as well. I didn't know the names of the other two, but I recognized one of them. The man on the right, holding a blunt flare on a chain, smacked Hafner's shoulder bracingly. "You're fine, Haf. That was just an auto-defeat event." "Whatever. You looked pretty scared to me too, Naga." "Can you blame me? That elf cursor went past red into black. I've never seen one that high." "Yeah, that was insane." Based on their conversation, neither seemed to be beta testers, nor Lind and Shavita's, who were speaking a short ways off. I snuck a peek at the 5th member. He was a thin man, wearing an anneal blade like mine. He wore a chain coif that hung low over his head, so I couldn't see higher than his mouth. But I didn't think he was present for the second boss battle. I was pretty sure I'd never seen him before, but there was something eerily familiar about his manner. I wanted to check with Asana, but they were standing just 30 feet from the tree we were hiding behind, and I didn't want them to detect our whispers. I could possibly stroll out with a friendly greeting and not get a bunch of swords in my face, but they weren't going to be happy to see me either. It was a good place to use my hiding skill, but if they saw through it, that would only make the situation worse. Fortunately, they had no idea we were here, and at a gesture from Lind, the 5 huddled for a meeting. I could only pick up isolated phrases in that hushed tone, but I began to get a sense of the topic. "Is supposed to be in the north of the forest. We get there at the start of the quest. Next destination is shared with the guild quest, so we'll follow that in the evening in the first overall meeting at the town. So if we get to the guild established by..." Aha, I thought. Based on the way he was talking, it seemed their quest info came from a different beta tester, not Argo. I guessed that it was probably the unidentified fellow with the anneal blade. I made a mental note to buy info on him from Argo, then concentrated from the conversation again. But now they were talking about how to deal with the monsters in the forest. I didn't catch anything of note. They raised their fists and saluted at the end of their talk, and then headed off to the north. Once the clanging of their heavy footsteps disappeared, I heard a frosty voice command me to let go. I turned and realized I had still gripping Asana's hood tight. Sorry. I hastily let go, and she snorted and put her hood back on. Asana's expression shifted from angry mode to questioning mode. So, what do you suppose that was about? I wasn't sure which part of the conversation she was referencing, so I shrugged my shoulders. I don't know. I was certain that we'd see a second version of Gizmel, but it was a totally different person. Even though the forest elf was clearly the same guy. That's the weird part. If they were both different, it would mean the system rolls different NPCs every time the fight event is generated. That would at least make sense, I noted, arms crossed. Asuna sent a glance my way from beneath her hood. Was it always the same people during the beta? Yeah, I only participated in this particular battle 3 times, but the forest elf was always the long-haired blonde guy, and the dark elf was always the short-haired lady. Basically Kismel, at least in appearance. Asuna thought over the answer for a few moments, then shook her head. I suppose we can't say anything for sure until we get at least witnesses this scene one more time, but we should get moving now. The mist's thickening. Just as she said, the western end of the little grove had already turning white. If we got lost in the unique mists of this forest, we'd only have visibility of 15 to 20 feet, and the monsters' encounters would rise. Fortunately, the staircase we were heading for was to the northeast, so we didn't have to charge into the mist. Gotcha. They said the strategy meeting was tonight, so we've got some time. Let's just avoid combat where we can. I headed away from the tree, and only after several steps did I realize that Asuna wasn't following. The fencer was frozen next to the tree, staring at an empty space where the battle event had just taken place. Eventually, she snapped out of it and trotted over to catch up. I was going to ask her what she was looking at, but reconsidered. The match over the dark forest floor resumed. We managed to stay ahead of the tide of mist and ran along only 2 monsters along the way. So it did not take long at all to reach the staircase. The shadowy mouth of the passage down to the 2nd floor opened in the middle of a mossy ground. It had been less than a day since we'd come up those stairs, but it felt like several. Asuna stared at the opening, apparently lost in the same thought. You don't think that time flows differently at the elf camp, do you? I don't think even the nerve gear can affect the passage of time, I said, laughing it off. She glared at me. Not that's what I'm saying. I can send this realistic data to our sensory centers, so maybe it can adjust the way we perceive time. That's all I'm wondering. The way we perceive it? So, even if one day has actually passed, it feels like 3? Yes. Wait, forget I said that. There's no use for that function. Huh? I stared at her in confusion. She blinked a few times, searching for the right words, then murmured, I just don't want to rely on false hopes. In a flash, I understood what she meant. She'd been hoping that these 39 days in the world of SEO were shorter period time in real life, say 10 days, or just 1, maybe even a single second. How much easier her life would be if that were true, but sadly, it was clearly impossible for one's minds and senses to be accelerated to hundreds of times the normal speeds during a full dive. I didn't know the fundamental properties of how the nerve gear worked, but even if I could guarantee that, instead of agreeing that it would be an escape to fantasy, I put word to the thought that rose the bitten from the deep in my chest. You said it was all about surviving today. I always thought that was a perfect statement. I never occurred to me to think about stacking each and every day as I go along. The fencer looked like she was choosing her words carefully again. She grinned faintly. Are you the type of person who has trouble sitting down to study every day? Definitely. I was the type to spend one desperate all-nighter studying before the test and then forget it all at once the test was over. I figured, but I suppose you deserve my thanks. You dedicated so much of your personal memory capacity to SAO beta tests. You've helped me out in countless ways. Should I take that as a compliment? Of course. Now, let's get moving to the main town. It's not that far, right? Yup. Just take the East Fork to the branch ahead. It'll be in sight in no time. It's called... It's something. I groaned at my loss of memory. Asuna sighed. I take back my compliment. We left the staircase behind and walked along the forest path for 5 minutes until a wall of thick logs appeared, blocking our way. This reminded me that the difference between the camps and the town was built with lumber from cutting down forest trees. The path was swallowed up by a large cast iron gate. The familiar bustling sound of all the human towns was coming from beyond the gate. In the beta, I felt so relieved to go from the elven base to the comfort of town. For some reason, I didn't get that feeling this time. When I noticed Asuna hiding farther beneath her hood than usual, I considered breaking out my favorite bandana disguise, then thought better of it. When I realized that few players were likely to be around at this time of day, when we reached the gate, I hailed the halberd-bearing guards, round-eared, of course. What's the name of this town? The craggy-faced NPC stared down at me and then growled, It's the town of Zumfort. Thanks, I replied, and started down the tunnel-like passage through the gate. Anna noted wryly, it didn't even start with an S. You can always ask to find out the name. The important part is where you find the stuff within the town. In that case, can you guide me to your recommended place to sleep? Sure thing. Any particular requests? Asuna thought this one over very seriously. I'd like to say that I want a bath, but we'll just be back at the base camp by tonight. As long as the beds are nice, the area is quiet, and I have a nice view, anything will do. I doubt there's anything else you could even add to narrow that down further, I grumbled quietly. As it happened, though, finding a quiet places with good view is quite easy in Zumfut. The town itself was not made of ordinary buildings, but 3 gigantic trees that stood together like monstrous baobabs. Their trunks were hundreds of feet wide, well over 200 feet tall. The insides of the trunks were hollowed out into many floored structures, so the farther up you went, the better the view, and the more distance from the noise in the surface. When we exited the tunnel, Asuna's eyes went wide as she saw the massive broad trees looming overhead. Wow, they look like skyscrapers. On the inside, too. I think they go up 20 floors. The view from the top is stunning, but there's one problem, which is no elevator. Asuna said she didn't mind that, so I pointed her toward the tree to the right. The space between the 3 trees was Zumfut's teleport square. It was already a day since the gate had been activated, but there were still some people walking through the blue portal for few times every minute. Those with starter equipment and no gear at all had to be tourists from the town of beginnings. I hoped they wouldn't venture outside the town, but the fact that those who had chosen to stay safe felt secure enough to come visit was a reassuring sign. The northern end of the plaza was a semicircular meeting place, like that in Tolbana, down at the first floor. Most likely, this was where the strategy meeting Lind mentioned would take place. We approached the southeast baobab with the square to our left. A wide staircase went up to meet the elevated entrance to the tree. Next to it was a bulletin board of the classic kind. parchment fixed to a flat wooden board. Right smack in the center was a large announcement. The strategy meeting starts at 5 o'clock. That's going to leave us plenty of time, Asuna murmured. I suggested we rent a room before coming up with ideas on how to pass the time. At the top of the stairs and through the natural knothole in the trunk, the great hall of the first floor filled my view. Players and NPCs chatted happily and strode over wooden floor, which had been polished to such a shine that the rings of the tree's age stood out as bright and clear. The outer walls of the hall were lined with shops selling food. In the center was a large, spiraling staircase that led up to the ceiling. Wow, Asuna exclaimed as she approached the stairs and marveling how the steps and handrails extend directly out of the grain. So everything in here is just one giant piece of wood. It must have been incredibly hard to carve it all out. I was tactful enough not to point out that everything here was generated digitally and not physical in nature. Instead, I nodded in agreement and rapped on the handrail with my knuckle. If we go to Boabab in the back, technically, I think they call it the yew tree, you can meet the mayor near the top, and he'll talk your ear off about how hard it was to carve these out. It's actually where you start the first mission in the guild quest. I wonder if the guilds and wood carvers have any connection. Now that is a truly long story. The short version is that long ago you had 3 different groups carving out the 3 trees, getting to all these fights. So some warriors / blacksmith / carpenter guy united the entire town. In recognition of his feat, some king from another floor gave him the sigil of a guild leader. Anyway, that hero descendants have been the mayors of Zumfurt ever since. The mayor now says that the precious guild sigil has been stolen, and the guild quest is all about getting it back for him. I'm guessing you have no interest in guild-related stuff, Asuna? Not at the moment, she said flatly. Her attractive lips twisted into a bit of a sneer. I mean, according to Argo's book, don't guilds set it up so that certain percentage of the money you make gets automatically deducted? Yeah, that's right. In fact, one of the best things about a leader sigil, I'm not saying that I'm desperate to keep all my money. I'm just saying I don't think that kind of heavy-handed system forcing you to participate in that way. I see, I replied, but I sensed something dangerous in her response. At the exit of the stairs from the first floor to the second floor of Einkrad seemed like ages before, I told Asuna that if someone she trusted invited her to a guild, she should accept. That there was an absolute limit to what she could accomplish alone. I knew full well that Asuna was not the type of person to swear loyalty and service to someone else. But at the same time, I knew she harbored a special quality that I didn't possess. She had talent to inspire others, to lead. It was hard to imagine her leading her own guild, but if she was perhaps a high-ranking officer in a large guild, she might shine brighter than anyone else. Asuna, still frowning. What about you? Did you join a guild in the beta? No, I didn't, I muttered, trying to avoid the uncomfortable sense of being seen right through. But it wasn't because I hated the tax system or didn't want to work under someone's command or anything like that. It was just a matter of efficiency. Once again, she had pinned me. I raised my hands in surrender. I guess. SAO is rare for an MMO, in that it's more efficient gaining experience alone or with a partner than in a large party, at least in the early stages. In the beta, all I cared about was how far I could get in a month. I considered mentioning the theoretical limit of playing solo. I had been thinking about just moments before, but it didn't seem to be necessary at that point in time. I see, Asuna said, though I wasn't sure how she'd interpret my answer. At least the frown was gone. She was about to say something, then reconsidered, and turned to the staircase, clicking her boots to change the topic. Well,
let's get climbing these stairs. Did you say that the tree had 20 floors? Do the lodgings cost differently depending on the floor? No, the factors of its size of the room, whether it has windows or not. You get better views higher up. The only difference is how long it takes you to get there. I see. And just so you know, I'm not racing you to the top. I didn't say it was a race, I protested. But Asuna had already leaped over the handrail onto the stairs and was flying upward. I hurried after her and caught up. But as she had seized the advantageous inner position, I needed to run along a longer distance just to keep up. As movement speed in SAO was dictated by equipment, weight, and agility points, speed-oriented Asuna had distinct leg up on me, a more balanced player. I ended up chasing her all the way to the top floor, wheezing heavily with my hands on my knees, despite there being no point. Asuna watched my anguish with cool disinterest. I win. As the winner, that gives me the right to choose the room. That's not fair. You said it wasn't a race. It certainly wasn't. Anyway, where's the desk? Ah, over there. I stared at her grudgingly as she strode across the spacious hall. Something about that last line stuck out to me, but she was already speaking to the NPC in the inn menu open. Normally, check-in happened at the first floor, or what otherwise the lobby of any inn, but larger facilities like this one had special NPC on each. Wait, why was I thinking about this now? For some reason, I snuck up stealthily to where Asuna was earnestly pursuing the list of empty rooms. She poked the window when she found one she liked, entered the length of stay, and paid the fee. Then closed the window, turned to me with a very rare smile on her face. I got a nice-looking room on the south side. It was a bit expensive, but since we're each paying half, it's not so bad. This way. Then she pushed me from behind, jolting me into motion. The center of the circular floor was the staircase hall, and there were 2 concentric circles of rooms along the sides. Therefore, any room in the inner circle did not have windows to the outside. Naturally, Asuna had chosen a room on the outer circle. She squeezed the knob open on the door reading 2038. And identified her as the owner and opened accordingly. 2 seconds after, watching the cape wave through the open door, I made up my mind to follow. This was easily the best view I'd ever have in any room. Not only was it spacious, but the entire south wall was one glass window, which gave us 200-foot-high view of the forest and the outer perimeter of the castle beyond that. Asuna pulled back her hood and pressed herself against the window as she looked out through it. Then she spun around with a burst of excitement. This is amazing, Kirito! We can see the entire forest of the wavering mists. She chatted slowly, considering as the sentence continued, until she finally realized what had happened. Asuna's frozen smile wore off. Her mouth grew tense, and a red blush started creeping up from the base of her neck. She opened and closed her mouth 2 or 3 times, looked left to right as though seeking something, then picked up a strange-looking fruit that had been left there on the table to core. With a perfect overhand form, she pitched the fruit directly at my forehead and screamed at a painful volume. "What are you doing in here?" Now, I might be careless, thoughtless person in many ways, but this one instance, I felt my reaction was justified. This isn't fair. The pink-purple striped fruit was, fortunately, or unfortunately, extremely hard, and rather than exploding into chunks against my forehead, split into 2 clean halves, because we were in town. I felt the impact and suffered no damage. I caught both halves in my outstretched hands and took a bite of one. The milky white flesh was crispy and pleasant, with a flavor somewhere between an apple, a pear, and a leeky. Asuna breathed heavily with smoldering rage as she watched me chow down on the fruit. Eventually, she realized most of the responsibility of the current situation was on her shoulders and kicked the ground timidly. I'm sorry. Clearly, this wasn't your fault. Well, I could have said something when I noticed what was happening, I answered, planning to stop there so that I still had some ammo to use against Asuna at later time. But she looked so uncomfortable that I had to offer a better olive branch. I just followed you in the door the same way I walked into Kismil tent when we were staying there. But you paid for this room, so I should have checked with you first. No, I'm the one that dragged you into this. I'm sorry for throwing that fruit at you. Asuna's facial effects finally wore off, and she regained her normal expression. You said that any party member can go freely and out into an in-room, right? Yup. How does the cost work then? Does it subtract the money equally from everyone? That depends on the setting you entered when renting the room. Remember how there was an occupancy number on the window? If you set that to 1, you pay the whole cost. If it's multiple people, then the cost splits. The odd expression on her silent face told me she was remembering it had been set to room for 2. In that case, my wallet had already suffered the loss of half the cost of a deluxe room. But that wasn't anything I couldn't make up. Don't worry, if we split up the party, I'll still be able to rent my own room, but only if I get back the cost of what I've already spent here. She didn't respond to the half-joking suggestion either. Eventually, she came to a conclusion of some kind. We're not spending the night here, just using it to rest until the evening meeting, right? Well, that was the plan. I want to be back at the Dark Elf camp by tonight. Okay, let's leave it at that then. Leave it at what? Well, I only paid the price on the assumption that we'd been splitting it. It would have been crazy to spend that amount on my own without even staying the night, Asuna announced, then scanned the room for beds on either side and pointed at one on the east wall. This one will be mine, and just so we're absolutely clear, there's a border right here that must be respected. She indicated a line straight down the middle of the room. With her tone, then walked over to the sovereign territory and removed her chivalric rapier +5, breastplate, hooded cape, gloves, boots, and loose comfortable. She sat down on the bed and looked up at me. I'm going to take a little nap. You ought to get some rest yourself. Okay, I said. We needed to conserve money where we could. We needed to rest when we could. We needed to be spending the night at the same room. Well, tent, anyway. This wasn't the time to be succumbing to the confusion status effect. Wait, SAO didn't have a confusion effect. At any rate, I moved to my territory and removed my Neelblade +8 coat and any other armor. When I sat down at the bed, I was facing directly at Asuna, which felt awkward, so I rolled back into a lying position. Appropriately for the price we paid, the pillows and mattress were soft and comfortable. I felt sleep quickly approaching. I'd been up since 2 in the morning. After all we'd been through, I had earned a bit of a nap. About our earlier conversation, Asuna said across the room. My eyelids opened up about 3/4 of the way. Which was? I prompted, looking up. Asuna was still sitting on the side of the bed, boots off and the feet dangling. Her response took me by surprise. About the experience game, better with 1 or 2 people than a whole party. What about it? I raised my head, then recalled Asuna had been about to say something back at the staircase when I'd finished mentioning it. But perhaps that was just my imagination. Just wondering, alone or with a partner? Which is better? Meaning which gives you better experience points. The fencer nodded. I lowered my head back against the pillow again, blinked a few times to clear the sleep away, then thought of my answer. It's not as simple as one or the other. The reason you don't gain as much with a full party is because it's really hard not to have some strength to go waste. You can't surround a small monster with 6 people and swing away wildly. If you break into 2 halves of 3, it's hard timed when to switch. It'll be different once we find a map with a whole bunch of extra large mobs to fight up all at once. And of course, more people you have, the safer it is. I prefaced, then actually answer the question. Soloing, or playing with a partner, are basically the same thing. The two-man team, if you can hunt twice as fast as a solo, your rate will be better. But that's difficult to do. You need to be able to switch from one player's sword skill directly into the other's. At this point, I finally realized what Asuna was wondering about. I looked back at her, and our eyes met directly. So I quickly glanced back at the ceiling and coughed to hide my embarrassment. Well, that's the ideal outcome, but it takes a lot of time to work together that smoothly. But at this point, safety is more important than efficiency. So in that sense, you'd want to have a partner rather than fight solo. Kirito, if I'm ever more of a hindrance than a help, you'd better tell me, she announced, clear and firm. I held my breath. The fencer stared me down with a calm expression, nothing like her fluster just a minute ago. She put her fists on her knees and continued. Like I told you back in Tolbana, I left the town at the beginning so I could continue to be myself. But maybe I've forgotten that feeling, bit by bit over time. We've been fighting side by side since meeting up in Urbas. But if that's making things harder for you or causing you leveling pace to drop, that's not what I want to do. So she could be herself. I didn't know enough about how other people thought to truly understand those words. I didn't even know how I was processing this insane game of death we've been trapped inside. It frightened me, of course. I wanted to be free of it. I didn't want to die, and I felt hatred at Akihito Kayaba for orchestrating it all. As a result of all this, I'd focused on nothing but making myself stronger since the day the game began. I prioritized efficiency, gathered information, and tested out my ideal build, and gave up on everything else. So the fact that I was now working with Asuna, the fencer, was the result of a decision that doing so would improve my chances of survival. There was no other reason. There shouldn't have been. You're very strong, I finally put into words. You're not holding me back in the slightest. In fact, with your new chivalric rapier, your damage per second is higher than mine. But it's not just about your DPS numbers. Your poise in battle, the execution of your sword skills. I'm in no position to claim you're not good enough. On the contrary, if you decide to keep working with me, I'd be grateful. It felt silly to say these things while I was rudely lying on the bed, but Asuna only straightened her back, still and silent. I thought what I detected in her slender body trembling slightly. Wait, what does that reaction mean? But before I had more time to wonder, she simply said, "Oh, in that case, I guess I'll stick around for a bit." Cool. Glad to hear it. It felt like we ought to shake on it. I lifted my head off the pillow, but Asuna was already lying on the bed firmly on her own territory and rolling back to the wall. With her back turned to me, she whispered, "Well, I'm going to take a nap until noon. Good night." Okay. Sweet dreams. I lowered my head back down, wondering what her deal was. It felt like I ought to take this time to think things over, but the Sandman was attacking me again, and I only had enough willpower to set an alarm before closing my eyes and succumbing. Across the surface of my mind, little thoughts, rosebuds, and bubbles then popped. So much stuff happened in the span of this one day. At this rate, we're going to be busy with conquering the third floor. I guess it's not that bad knowing there's someone there to watch your back. At that point in time, I had no idea that just 7 hours later, external factors beyond my control would threaten the dissolution of our team.